Thanks everyone for joining in today. I'm Vaibhav. I also go by V. I'm the founder and CEO of Privado. Privado is a privacy tech company. It helps you comply with laws like GDPR and CPRA. The way we do that is we enable your engineers to build products fast without breaking any privacy laws. We're going to discuss at least the approach of how Privado can help you automate data mapping and other aspects of your privacy programming today. But we're going to make sure it's generic enough that you can still kind of learn from a more data mapping and maturity perspective as well. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Gaspar, for your introduction.
Thank you very much, V. It's great to be here with you. So I started my journey with privacy more than 20 years ago when I was a young labor lawyer, and I had the opportunity to study the different European state labor laws and those related to privacy in the European Parliament. And then as a labor lawyer, I started to work more and more with privacy-related topics. And in the last, I would say, 8 years, I've been working exclusively privacy-related topics. And honestly, I was a typical privacy lawyer sitting in his ivory tower. And even if I didn't want just to do as a privacy as a ticking box exercise, I was kind of thinking that I tell you the legal requirements, but you have to translate it into technology, and it's not my business. And yeah, I wasn't the best colleague, and slowly I realized that it's a really cross-functional being a privacy lawyer, and I can't act as a gatekeeper for technologists and engineers. And I started to learn more and more about technology. And some 3 or 4 years ago, I started to work as a privacy engineer. And honestly, I had to program my brain and transition to a different kind of way of thinking. And I realized that the real value with privacy is to help technologists and engineers to bake into the products the high level, nice privacy principles and rules and figure it out together what and how it can be translated into practice.
Perfect. Thanks, Gaspar, for that introduction. I mean, your introduction kind of reminded me my own journey. My journey is probably on the opposite side of your explanation. So I was working in product roles in a consumer company, technology consumer company. So I was working closely with about 10 to 20 engineers and building those products, right? And of course, privacy was not a thought at all, right? So my journey back into the privacy world has been interacting with privacy lawyers like you, and then collaborating to reach a place where we can convert those principles back into product requirements. So it's interesting how, I mean, privacy is, of course, as the laws have evolved, people have come in from different backgrounds. The roles are also slightly different. So why are we talking about data mapping coming in 2024, right? And Gaspar, you mentioned in your kind of introduction, you've been like for the last 8 years specifically in privacy, working in consulting roles as well across many technology companies, and the last 3 years in more dedicated privacy engineering roles as well. So I just wanted to get a sense from you, from a maturity perspective, what do you think? Is the conversation still relevant, or has that completely become automated? What's your sense of the market and your experience so far?
Yes, I think that still data maps and data registers are the number one artifact for privacy, and the most valuable for many reasons, also for verification, audit, or building customer trust, or whenever a regulatory investigation occurs, or even for breach notification is really the very first document which any privacy professional is asked for, and also to be able to know where our data sit, and yeah, actually what, so for which information we have to secure our compliance. So it's really the basics of everything. And even if we consider the data subject requests, whenever one of our users or customers requests for deletion or correcting their data, this is absolutely fundamental to know which kind of personal data we process, where in which data they are located, which are the third party to which we trust, maybe with email transfers, also for deletion if we are requested to delete their data, to respect the policy, or also for consenting, if or consent management. Obviously, if we ask for consent, we have to tell the customers and data subjects which personal data we are going to process. Also, the legal basis, the purpose for processing. Yeah, basically all kinds of controls are based on data mapping, and these are the foundations of privacy compliance.
Yeah, and Gaspar, you made a interesting point, right? I mean, it's like as you're building the program up, and of course, everyone like who's here, I'm assuming, understands like data maps are foundational. I mean, 2 points that kind of resonated with me a lot. One was around the use of data, and kind of like I think there was a decision right now around using data for training machine learning model, and then that context on, hey, we have a data in a database, but then it gets used for training and then gets used for personalization later. That's the kind of use that you want to capture in your data map. So we're going to discuss that in the next slide. But another interesting point that you mentioned that kind of I've been hearing a lot from especially privacy people working in B2B companies is customer trust, wherein the data map actually translates into winning sales deals because you have a better privacy posture. So can you talk about that a little bit on or expand on that?
Yeah, definitely. So for me, privacy is never a blocker, but much more an enabler. So I don't see something which blocks or acts as a gatekeeper for technology, but it's fundamental for building trust in front of our customers, and not only customers, but also for auditors or regulators. And it's very important to be able to show that we know our data, where they are, because that's the very first step to be able to show to our customers that we know what we don't know, and we try to put all the data on our radar, especially with AI. It is very fundamental to be able to know and show to our customers if any personal data are being used for training purposes, in case of AI large language models, for instance.
Makes sense. Awesome. So yeah, that was kind of a good example of where privacy is not only like not the blocker, but actually something which the sales team will come more and more, or the marketing team will come more and more to present the privacy posture in front of your B2B end customers, right?
Right.
And also, of course, Apple is the example on the B2C side. So, I mean, while all of that makes a lot of sense, one of the key things we have identified is everyone is building a data mapping program. That's the foundation. But there's kind of a key gap in the current way you do data mapping, especially if you have engineers building software in your company. So if you look at this flowchart on the left, you'll see a data inventory approach. That's kind of what we've seen in companies a lot, where either you will get a list of all your third parties because you have a good TPRM program. So you're doing vendor risk assessments, or you get the list from SSO tools like Okta. So you'll get an initial list of third parties. You will get your data assets, databases, data tables, data lake, scan them. And depending on the maturity of the organization, you will get some level of data discovery done. So imagine you either in a software or on an Excel sheet, you have this asset and third party view where you have a list of all the databases, all the third parties. And for databases, let's say you have the context of what data sits in each database. For third party, it's not possible to scan all of them. Maybe for few, you have that context. The biggest problem or the interesting piece about privacy is now once you want to go from there to a complete data map, for some of this, actually, a people driven approach could. So let's say we take Salesforce. In some instances, actually, a people would be like a sales rep would be filing data in the CRM, and that's a processing activity that can be captured by running an assessment. But for most things, it's actually the software which is driving the data collection, sharing, storage, and processing of data. But because the choke point in this entire process or the way to get to the final data maps are still through manual questionnaires, while you can automate everything on the inventory side, when it finally comes to your data map, they're still dependent on humans. They're still dependent on you to talk to people, get them to fill assessments, and then generate a data map, which is usually imprecise. So I'm going to take an example of the Zoom webinar, but before I go there, Gasper, I would love to see if you can share some of your experience on the approaches, especially like the data asset approach that companies have taken, and what's the problems or challenges you see there.
Yeah, definitely. So according to my experience also as an external consultant, and I used to work with many multinationals also, was that with the, I would call it, old school method of creating data maps and data registers, meaning sending out questionnaires and organizing interviews. It is very hard to find, and most of the time is spent with defining the different expressions, because I realized that anonymous data or pseudonymous data or even personal data means something for a lawyer, for a privacy lawyer, somebody who sits in Europe, and somebody who is from the US, and also for technologists. And we can spend many weeks and even months just discussing or trying to understand what you mean when you say that's anonymous, and that's just an anonymous ID. That's my favorite term, because typically an ID, user ID, for instance, it's meant to identify somebody, so it's not anonymous, maybe pseudonymous. And then so I find that much information is lost in translation. And just one personal remark: during my years of university, I used to work as an Italian-Hungarian interpreter, and I really enjoyed it because I enjoyed the way I can translate or interpret from one language to another one. And somehow it is similar that I have to translate from legal and different. So also for a labor lawyer or privacy lawyer, the same terms usually mean something a bit different than lawyers from other areas. So I see it as the biggest challenge is to understand each other, to find a common language. And I don't see that questionnaire are the right tools to define those language. Interviews are usually very difficult to schedule because engineers don't usually feel that they are hired just to chat with lawyers, but basically they feel that they should do their job and write codes. And yeah, I find, and I realized many times that months can pass by very quickly without really achieving and proceeding with our, yeah. And honestly, For me was very decisive when I looked for new positions and new challenges in the realm of privacy. I always wanted to work with companies which are keen on working with privacy tech solutions, because I I spent way too many hours just wasting each other times. And if we try not to leverage privacy tech solutions for the compliance of technology, and why to leverage everywhere else, not just for the technology.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Gasper. And just to add on your point, right? I mean, and I'm going to answer the question in the Q&A as well. And if anyone has any more questions, feel free to keep adding them as well. So, I mean, you made like a great point, right? I mean, we can get the data asset and the register, but then to figure out one is, of course, like that conversation, is this really personal data? But let's say we know here is a database, a data table where you have email address, phone number, IP address, right? That can be used by a piece of software for like IP address can be used by of software for preventing DDoS attacks, which is for security and fraud prevention. And that has a way less privacy risk. Worse, it can also be used to get location and then for personalization or for targeting, and that's a different privacy risk. And that's the reason only getting a data asset register is not enough. You have to go the manual questionnaire route, right? The gap that we kind of see in the market is, and kind of with our customers that we've been able to solve is, if you look at the software, a lot of the business logic actually for your products, which are driving data of millions of users depending on your scale, that's where the logic of data collection, use, processing, storage, sharing is already written. So instead of going to a person who wrote the code, if we go to the code directly and say, okay, we're going to scan this and figure out the same information, we'll reach to a place where there are precise data maps. Now, there was a question kind of like this slide doesn't answer that, but it was, why not start from defining the processing activity and then talk to people who are business owners and then from there drive the ROPAs. So in my experience, I mean, that's where how the initial ROPA registers, everyone created by defining these processing activities. I think that's like, if you're starting from a place where nothing, I think that's a good place to do, because you can still get a lot of things done from leaders. But if you think about, especially let's say for, again, as I was given an example, let's say of an HR tool, you might interview the person and they can tell you a general in how hiring is done or how onboarding is done. But let's say if you are building a software, right? How that software works, no one person knows. You can't talk to the CTO and say, okay, tell me how the software works. Maybe on a high level, they can tell you, but to really understand, you'll have to go you'll have to talk to individual people. Hope I answer your question. And yeah, I just also wanted to take an example of the Zoom webinar. So everyone is attending a Zoom webinar right now. And if you look at like different pieces of processing happening, you might have the Zoom app installed on your computer. So if you look at that app itself can automatically collect data from your Mac or computer. That's a decision written by an engineer in the software. Can share data with SDKs or third parties, can collect less data, can collect more data. All of that logic is in that Zoom software for your app or for your browser. The same thing if you move ahead. When you all registered for the webinar, you might have gotten notification, emails, you're filling up the poll, so a report gets generated. That's a software written by another team. And then finally, this entire streaming experience is maybe handled by another team. So that's a different piece of software. So while we are chatting and doing the Zoom webinar experience, even here, there are multiple pieces of software built by smaller teams, and everyone is working together to give you this experience. Now, you can scan all the databases, but then you have to get how much data is being collected where. That information is in the software. And that's precisely the pain point we've seen in the marketplace. So I'm going to take a pause, and again, feel free to add questions in Q&A. Privado team, if you can launch the second poll, that'll be helpful. Cool. So what we're trying to understand with this, and again, the next slide kind of answers this question, is what's your challenge with data mapping? Why are you here? So feel free to answer. I know it's a single choice, so pick the one which is the most painful. I know someone can say all of them, but yeah, the one that is kind of the most painful, the most challenging aspect, here, pick that for now.
In the meanwhile, if I might, I wanted to really underline what you just said, that it's all about the context in place of personal data and the information, because usually we lawyers say that it depends. That's the most common answer when we are asked about personal data.
Yeah, and that context is not in the database, which is static. It's in the
Yeah, it's in the
software,
code, and yeah.
or in the people, right? So if a sales rep is filling something,
Yeah.
but a large portion, if you're a tech company, is in the software. That's the missing
Yeah.
gap we see. So it's interesting. We got some answers back on the poll. So I think I would say like neck to neck, keeping them up to date and evergreen, and getting, because of human inputs, that's a big pain point. Limited automation, and then assessments taking a long time. I can understand this split as well, because I'm assuming most people have something done. So then it's about are we sure what we have in the map is correct? Is it up to date? And then how can we get more automation? So that makes a lot of sense, given we are like 8 years from when GDPR was passed. Awesome. I'm going to move to the uh, next slide, and then also pick up a question from a Q&A perspective. Cool. Awesome. So we kind of looked at from a gap perspective. You can create a data inventory and get some insights there, but a lot of information is in the software, especially when it comes to context and use and sharing and storing and all of that, collection as well. But when it comes to software, you still can't take the same old approach of running assessments. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. In my experience, and we'll go into depth on each one of them. The first one is the processing of data via software right now is very distributed. What it simply means is it's not one person and one team which does it. There are 50, 100, 200 small teams or squads. That's how development happens, which are on their own deciding and building the software. What it means is like they decide their own tech stack, which means they can decide if the database is going to be A or B. They decide what's the best library they're going to use. They decide how much data they're going to collect. A lot of those decisions are taken by these small teams, and then the software all comes together. So if you have to map all of that manually using questionnaire, that means you have to interview, I don't know, 100 to thousands of people, these small team owners. That takes a lot of time. I think the lost in translation piece, Gaspar, you covered like brilliantly. We can spend months deciding what is personal data, anonymous, pseudo-anonymous data. And the best, I also like that example. And the user ID is anonymous is like a perfect example of that. I think it came up with in the audience poll as well, in terms of like data mapping to taking too long and not keeping up with product changes. So these are the four big pain points we see in the marketplace as well. As we talk to other leaders and other folks, I'm going to take a couple of example and then hand it over to Gasper for his take as well on some of this. So the first one that I like to explain is like, how does the data, like in your company, if you're building software, moves, right? So let's take an example of a streaming company. Let's say Netflix, for example, right? If you're watching a show on Netflix, you would open up your TV app. That's where you interact with the company's software. That's the user interface. Now, as you are using the app, you might log in. So you might give your email address and password, or you might log in via browser using a code. Then Netflix, as you're using it, might collect your IP address, might collect some more device identifier, depending on how the software is written. So that's the first piece, user interface. That's where data collection happens a lot. And then the second thing which happens is data sharing, because the app itself will have some third party integrations and some data flows will start from there. Once that happens, then the next thing which happens is Netflix will have these small mini services or features that they've written. So for example, when you go in and say login, there is a small mini feature here which will run and say, oh, okay, Vaibhav, I'm going to check Vaibhav's data in my database. If it exists, I'm going to allow Vaibhav to log in, and I'll pick the subscription plan as well. So if I'm on the basic plan, I get to see Netflix with ads. If I'm in the premium plan, I get HD with no ads, right? So there's a feature written, and that feature is the context of data. It can take very minimum data and process, or it can take a lot more data, right? So that's the decision which is taken in the middle layer, which is they're called services, backend applications, or for simplistic, these are small features written by small teams. This is the distributed part. And finally, you have the data layer. This is where the data will be read and written from, and more analysis will be done. So in a Netflix context, as you're using the app, a feature like a authentication feature will get used. Your feed will be personalized. That'll be another feature. If you're doing payments, then there'll be another feature. So the software piece is made up of these countless and complex data flows happening within your system. And these are smaller distributed teams building smaller software, all coming together to give you one experience. So getting to a place where you have visibility across the spectrum manually becomes very tough. That's why you need to take a more code driven approach. Now, there was a question which was related to this, which was any restriction to what data stores, homegrown solutions, or third party apps that automated data discovery tools can access or capture. So, great question. Ideally, if there is a data discovery solution homegrown or built, the challenge is in integration because you have to integrate data store by data store. It takes time. But ideally, there should not be a challenge in scanning data stores. If it's a data store in your system, you should be able to connect and scan it. On third parties, however, you can only scan the third parties which offer APIs for you to scan. So the big ones too, like Slack, Salesforce, Workday, typically more unstructured data like apps allow you to scan. So you can scan them and get information on what data sits in there. But for most SaaS apps, in a company, you might have hundreds or thousands of vendors. They're not offering an API that you can scan and you can figure out. So you have to rely back on assessment, or what we're going to answer later is through code scanning as well. So I hope that answers the question. Next, Gaspar, I would love to get your inputs on the next two slide, which is your experience working with the engineering teams and how you feel.
Yeah, I don't know who of you can relate to the feelings of this policeman when we try chasing engineers or hire folks from different teams, and the desperation he might feel, even if being a mounted policeman on a horse might be very useful for crowd control, for instance. But when we try to keep up pace with the technology and the different teams working in silos and working in sprints and releasing new pieces of software, I would say every second day or every week, yeah, it is almost impossible to organize the interviews, sending out questionnaires, and send out a questionnaire once a year, which is realistic and quite widespread among the different businesses, is really not the way to try to be compliant with privacy rules and regulations.
Like the way your data maps end up, where your energy, let's say, I know there were about 15% people in the leadership role, right? And you're looking at things from the top on your privacy program, optimizing that. So think of like if you're spending like about 12 to 18 months, 6 to 12 months on gathering data and building your risk register, you don't have any time left for actually fixing it. And as you're gathering the data, you see at the bottom is every week, as Gaspar was saying, software gets released. So Gaspar, I know you had some insights here as well. Would love to hear those as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So what I saw at many companies also with a relatively high maturity, privacy maturity, that even with core services where we would arrive is to identify the privacy risk or privacy risks, maybe label them if they are high, medium, or low, and maybe give them an ID and put it in the risk register. But that was usually the end of the privacy program. Even if we are honest with ourselves, that's the part where the real privacy program should start, because at the end of the day, what we try to do with privacy program is to eliminate or mitigate or reduce the risk. So it's nice to have labels for identify the different privacy risks, but the energy we spend and the time we spend on identifying the different data elements, the purpose, the legal basis, and at the end of the journey, the privacy risk, we usually don't have enough energy, time to work to identify the risk owner, for instance, who is responsible for reducing or eliminating that risk. And usually very few companies are mature enough to go back to the risk owner and control and check if the risk mitigation plan was really completed and what to do about the risk still existing in the risk register. So
Yeah, I mean,
actually, yeah,
sorry, go ahead, guys.
no, it's very important to leave enough room and time for risk mitigation, and the only way, because the bandwidth of the privacy professionals and technology and risk owners is limited, to reduce the first part of the privacy program and leave more time for risk mitigation.
Yeah, I mean, like the way I think about it is, I mean, we can look at our adjacent folks in security, right? So instead of like, of course, product managers, developers are building products. That's their core job. And trust, having trust in the products is critical. So having software which doesn't have security issue, privacy issues is the same. But from a resource perspective, we can either spend time in creating the risk register or automate that part and spend time in making them fix the risk itself. So that's the choice that you're making. With that, kind of the solution that we're proposing, and a lot of our customers have also used the same or arrived to that approach, is we kind of looked at software as the central point of your missing gap of your data mapping program, which is running, collecting, sharing data, is to move to a place where you start to scan code and then essentially basically automate the last piece of your program, which tells you about the data flows, tells you about the use of data, tells you about the risk register automatically. So, Gaspar, I know you've kind of seen all approaches, right? From defining processing activity in an Excel sheet to data assets to even the code scanning piece. What's your view on that? Any experiences you've had?
Yeah, actually, one of the main challenges when trying to comply with the different privacy regulations is to define the different data processing activities and to find the right level of description of the different data processing activities, just to be able to make it clear, transparent with the plain English, and also for the regulators to contain all the elements which are necessary to describe that processing activity from a privacy perspective. And so in a code repository, for instance, we might have many different data processing activities and many different purposes for which we process the personal data, and that's quite a challenge to define and describe all these activities and find the legal basis for it after having defined the purposes, obviously, and the place of location or transfers also abroad and or internally in the company itself or with third parties.
Makes sense. And kind of this is what a privacy code scanning approach can deliver to your data maps, right? Essentially, the software gets ingested and that tells you the full data lifecycle of collection, sharing, storage, and use of data. And the main benefit you kind of see is essentially instead of spending time for your engineering department, software department in gathering data, you get the visibility fast. And then all your focus is on actually remediating the results, right? So getting the issues fixed, self deciding the legal basis based on a processing activity that we generate for you, looking at the data maps, looking at the data flow maps, and then closing in from there. And to Casper's kind of related point, essentially, of you have to spend a lot of time in defining a processing activity. And that's another place, the description we were talking about lost in translation, where when you have to decide that, that itself is a big exercise. So, in fact, like privacy code scanning solution, especially like Privado, we have spent a lot of time in automating this. Essentially, that's where AI can be used for privacy in a better way. So, we've ourselves used large language model to once we run a scan on your code repository. So these are your features or your apps. We also describe it and say, this is the processing activity that this software does. Once you have that information, it's super easy for you to understand what does this software do without even asking anyone any question. You have the linked inventory, you have the purpose from the description, and then you on yourself can also decide, hey, this is marketing, so of course we have to rely on consent, or this seems like a legitimate interest. You don't need context back before you start to add information. I don't know, Gaspar, you've seen that in action, if you had any opinion on the same.
Yeah, actually, it was the very first moment when I saw AI in practice, and I was really amazed by the so how much time we can save with this feature, and honestly, I couldn't see any engineers, even those writing the codes themselves, being able to define in such a compact way and the level of clarity. What is it really about? So not even a linguist could be, yeah, as precise and with all the words in that place, and no really useless word, but all with really meaningful roles in the sentences. So this is one of the nicest features of a privacy podcast I realized or I met.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Gasper. And just for everyone's, I know there are Q&A, some related question as well. I'm going to walk you all through the same real quickly and kind of show you the platform, what all you can see, and then also how do we build this data map. And then as you're getting questions, feel free to post them on the chat, and then I'll do my best to uh, answer them. So, Gasper, can you see the dashboard?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Perfect. Cool. So this, whatever you're seeing today is run by our privacy code scanning solution. It literally takes 5 minutes for us to go live. It integrates with your source code management system. So one integration point, and then we can run the scan. What we're scanning is not your data, but we're scanning the software your engineers are building. So again, if we go back to the data map slide, it's the software which was running, collecting, sharing, storing data. That's what we're focused on. And so I've scanned some open source code repository. So everything is real. Someone has built it and put it out in the world, so we can find the privacy risk of that. And so I'll start from the top and say, for example, in this account, when we ran the scan, we discovered about 40 data elements, some 100 third parties, and some sensitive data. And that's the first part, which takes a lot of time, right? Getting to that definition, as Casper was saying, what's personal data, what's my third party, what are my data flows, all of that conversation goes away. You get to the state automatically. So first of all, you get to see the list of data that your software is collecting, sharing, storing, processing, and you can go in and look at the list. We also attach these tags. So CPR is sensitive. I'm sure there are tags for GDPR sensitive. If I apply a filter here, for example, illness or medical condition, and for each data element, there is a full journey of that data type. So for example, let's say home address is something that you're concerned about and you want to figure out, hey, where are we sharing home address? You can just click here and it will show you like the full path. So for example, in this account, home address gets shared with 9 third parties. These are the 9 third parties: Tag Manager, Telium, Stripe, Braintree Payments. Gets stored in some databases like Sales Manager and gets logged in application logs as well. So that's the journey of address across the products, across all the software like a company has built. And if I click here, it will actually take me through it. It'll tell me the two products which is sharing address or which is storing address in a cookie as well. That's a view which is more data element view. You get the same view from a third party as well. So I know right now AI is top of mind for people in Europe because of the AI Act, and on US, trackers are top of mind. So with Privado, you cannot scan Facebook to figure out what data you share. But with Privado, you can actually click here and we will show you the data which is shared with Facebook Pixel from your mobile apps, websites, tag manager, wherever. So here's the data which gets shared with Facebook, automatically generated by our code scanning. And the second, which is on the AI side, also will tell you any data flows to your internal AI model and external third parties like OpenAI. So for example, in this case, email address is being shared with OpenAI. This is the software email vector DB, which is sharing. This is like a little code snippet. We'll look at this in the next. And the same view exists for databases APIs. So the first view is more of an account level view. And then the main thing that we've been talking about is context of data, use of data. So I'm going to take two examples. I'm going to take an example of a website and show you what the scan does. And we're going to look at the processing activities. And then I'm going to look at a backend feature that we were looking at in the diagram. So this is a website which is open source called Raccoon. This is by a fintech company out of Europe. So if you look at the data flow map that Privado created, you will see it drops a bunch of cookies. It has some user forms where it is collecting data. We'll look at that. And it has a lot of third-party integrations, and you'll see it's more pixel like Tag Manager, Trustpilot, things of that nature. So you get this information automatically. You also get the information of the data itself. What data does this app website collect, share, process? And then right at the bottom, you can read this summarized list of processing activities that this website is doing. So it's it's helping you do user checkout. It's helping the user create a trial plan, select a partner. It's also handling insurance cancellation and user data. So it's helping you do things like collect things like number, car registration number, car mileage, current insurance. So this is more of an insurance related website. So that's why you see this detail. So all of this is generated by our large language model. And again, you can go in and look at a specific flow and then get the information. So for example, you can say, okay, SSN, what's the flow of that? And it tells you it gets collected from these user forms. Checkout page, create session form, gets shared with these third parties and gets logged as well. So that's the full journey of SSN. And the same is available for a specific third party. So for example, in this case, let's say you want to figure out data being shared with this third party called Hedwig, you get that list as well. And finally, it also create issues. So this is the risk register part that me and Gaspar were discussing. Privacy issues are things in your product which do not fulfill your privacy promises. And these are actionable things that you can take back to an engineer and say, fix it. Like SSN is being shared with this third party. Here is the proof. And I'm going to click and send it to Jira from here so it gets resolved. So again, going back to our conversation, instead of spending time in building the register, you get the register and you spend time in fixing it. That's kind of the main insight. So I'm going to take a pause and before I move to the next repository and look at the chat and kind of react if there were any questions. So yeah, I know Deepthi had a question on what stage does this application come in. Deepthi, you can deploy it in two ways. One is this, what you're seeing is a direct integration into GitHub. So this is when there is no impact on the software development lifecycle. This is scanning whatever is live. The second way you can do it in phase two is make it part of your SDLC, which means all software changes, all new software changes will be run against a privacy code scanning tool. And then based on the result, it will either warn the developer or block it. And there are some more questions in the Q&A. So there are two questions. What data do we use for generating this processing activity? So let me take this example of Privado account. So this is the feature, right? So you'll have tons of these features built in. This is the description of that. For example, this Privado accounts API does user account management. So it helps you do account creation. So sign up, login, does email and Slack notification, and also logs data and event sending functionality exist. So for this, what our innovation is, we have identified places in code where data processing begins and ends. And that's the piece we pass to our large language model. It's all in-house, so no data leaves, no code leaves the environment. And that generates this processing activity. So it's really dependent on the code itself. It does not require anything else. Also, there was a question around, do we need to get any information or indexing from you? No, not really. All of this gets generated from one integration to your source code management system, and we can build this map up. Yeah, so there's a question, how often would you run this? So Privado runs in a continuous monitoring way, which means once the scan is done, whenever we see there is a change, someone pushes a new software or makes any changes, creates a new change, we automatically rerun the scan and then we build up these issues. So it's literally an autopilot. Once we do the integration, you don't have to scan it. We'll scan it based on the events that are coming in. So yeah, let's look at the second example, and then I'm going to move completely to Q&A. Is in this case, you'll see the data flow diagram represents more databases and APIs here because this is a backend feature. So this is the piece which is deciding, for example, in this case, when I log into an app, I'm going to take this and manage the login by looking at data from my database, right? So if I look at what data gets read from a database here, it'll tell me phone number, email address, date of birth, account password. These are the things that are being validated from the database itself. So that's kind of the part where we are calculating or generating these graphs. And then once we have this view, then we also have collaboration with engineers, in which case you can you can generate an assessment from Privado. The main advantage is this is pre-filled. You don't have to manually fill it. You can just click, engineers can click here and see the actual line of code where we discovered, let's say, account name, or let's say if they want to see data flows for email address, they can click here and they see line by line proof of how email went to SendGrid. Again, this is more for engineers to validate things. And we've seen real good success here because you're showing them and not asking. You're telling them, hey, we found this issue or we found this inventory. Just validate things so that your map gets created. And this is a super fast process. So I'll stop sharing or let me move to the official Q&A section. And I know we have 6 minutes left, so I'll feel free to ask more question and I'll pick anything which is in the chat as well. Cool. So yeah, there was a question around pricing. Yeah. So I mean, if you want to get any information on pricing, feel free to reach out to us and we should be able to answer. There was another question around how could Privado also help the non-engineering side, example Workday or non-product areas. We don't have to have a regular. Yes, that's a great question. So yeah, again, if we go back to our data map, right, there were two kind of processing that we were discussing. One is a very people-driven processing. So that's a good example is Workday, wherein your systems are not sending data to Workday. Well, in some cases they might be, but in most cases they're not. And so that piece Privado or any privacy code scanning solution cannot do. What we can do is we can look at your software and build the map for that. And especially like in the privacy world, why we also need this specialization is key is because you want to make sure your engineer's experience is good. So if you find an issue and you send it to the engineer, you don't want them to come back and say, hey, here, this issue doesn't make sense to me. That's why we really specialize in one thing, which is building the best privacy code scanning solution. So as privacy teams, you're empowered to detect, to build your risk register, build your data maps. And when it goes to engineers, they actually feel nice about it because they've been empowered as well with a scan that works and which has all the nice information. So for tools which are not connected to software, Privado or any privacy code scanning solution is not a good way to do it. Either you can do it via assessment because not everything can be scanned, or if it can be scanned, then there are some tools in the marketplace which do that as well. Yeah, hope I answered that question as well. Cool. There is one more question I can see, or at least a part of question that kind of I can answer. It was around kind of deployment mode and time to value. So that's another, as you're building up your privacy program, another advantage of a privacy code scanning solution is the time it takes to go live. So traditional data discovery solution, you need to integrate with each data store and then think about latency if you'll have any issues on production. With code scanning, it doesn't have any impact on production. And literally in your company right now, minimum there would be 3 to 4 security scanners scanning for security vulnerabilities. Why not have a privacy scan with the same process? You have secure software development lifecycle. You should have a privacy scanner for the same and get all the benefits, right? And getting that advantage benefit is easier because there is a process which exists. From an accountability perspective, some of our customers have done this and it has really worked. They had, for the security vulnerability, they had like an SLA system. So if a critical security vulnerability is found, they have to resolve it in X days. If not, it gets escalated all the way to the CEO. They actually just started discovering privacy issues and then put them in the exact same SLA. So now the privacy issues are also getting fixed because it's a process reuse. So people really like that the data program gets matured, privacy program gets matured as well. So yeah, that would be my answer on deployment and time to integration. Yeah, I guess those were all the questions that I could see. Yeah, awesome. We have 2 minutes left. I definitely want to thank Gaspar for coming in. I know you have seen a bunch of technologies and kind of you align with our approach on privacy code scanning. So thanks for coming in and sharing all your experience. I loved the journey of starting from labor law to privacy and then privacy engineering, and also the flavor you gave in terms of being a translator between Italy and the Hungarian language. So thanks for joining. Thanks everyone for joining in as panelists. I'll hand it over to Gaspar as well.
Thank you very much. And if I might give final advice. So get familiar with the different privacy tech solutions, because that's definitely the future. If you want to be involved in privacy, yeah, this is very important.
Thanks, Casper. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.